I demanded the immediate emancipation of all Africans in the colonies. It didn't, of course, happen. Pity. Oh, America, what was it you did not understand about slavery? Could we not have saved some suffering for our United States? Or as someone would come to say, what would have happened when Patrick Henry said, "Give me liberty or give me death," if one of his slaves had stood up and said, "Me too"? I would not live to see the end of this ungodly practice.
This is Randy Critical live on the fly. And we are continuing our three-part series, maybe four-part series, with a great guest, and that would be Professor Harvey Kaye, who is a historian really specializing on the Revolutionary War period that we're interested in at this week, going into the 4th of July. And the unsung hero, Thomas Paine. Name of his book that I read 15 years ago, which you have to get, is called Thomas Paine, or Tom Paine, Promise of America. You've got to read this book. And he's such a great storyteller. He's a professor at the University of Wisconsin at Green Bay, and he's written tons of books. Just look him up, Harvey J Kaye. He's a real treat. We're going to go right into it. Right after this little tune called Tom Paine's Bones. We'll be right back with the very, very colorful Harvey J Kaye.
I went out late one night by a river of discontent. I ran straight into old Tom Paine. Running down the road he went. He said, "I can't stop right now, child. King George is after me, and he'd have a rope around my throat, hang me from the Liberty Tree." Oh, I danced to Tom Paine's bones. Dance to Tom Paine's bones. Dance in the oldest boots I own to the rhythm of Tom Paine's bones. Dance to Tom Paine's bones. Dance to Tom Paine's bones. Dance in the oldest boots I own to the rhythm of Tom Paine's bones. He said, "We talked about freedom, justice for everyone, but since the very first word I spoke, I've been staring down the barrel of a gun." They said I preached revolution, and let me speak in my defense. All I did wherever I went was to talk a lot of common sense. So I danced to Tom Paine's bones. Dance to Tom Paine's bones. Dance in the oldest boots I own to the rhythm of Tom Paine's bones. Dance to Tom Paine's bones. Dance to Tom Paine's bones. Dance in the oldest boots I own to the rhythm of Tom Paine's bones.
Strange Hens, Tom Paine's Bones, yet another version of Tom. A lot of people seem to like that tune, and we're going to have another version later on by Laurent, I believe, Tom Paine's Bones. As I said in the preamble, we are continuing our discussion with Harvey Kaye on the life and times of the great American revolutionary journalist, Tom Paine. And nice to have you back. I really enjoyed the other day, but it went by so quickly, Professor.
So quickly, right?
It did.
And we've only reached, spring of 76.
That's right. We're right there, spring of 1776. And it's actually before the Declaration of Independence.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So that's where we were. 500,000 copies were sold. It created a stir, controversy, anger, joy, and everybody read it. 500,000 over the course of its time, but 100,000 in the beginning. So I don't know exactly where we left it. I don't want to have to look at it again, but we were talking about its impact and Adams.
Wait a minute. How could you? Wait. You can't say that. You can't say you don't want to look at it again.
I'm going to look at it again, but not right now. But no, we were talking about Abigail Adams and the ladies, right. And that's where we left it. John Adams and a few that would cement at that point forward, if I'm not correct.
Yeah. What's interesting is I think there were about 2,000 published in the first printing in the first couple of weeks, and they sold out almost immediately. And then in the course of that spring, about 120,000 copies were said to have been sold. And that doesn't include all of the newspapers that excerpted Common Sense. Now, it's worth noting what Common Sense did, because when you go to school and you read the history textbooks, usually they'll devote maybe a few lines to Thomas Paine before the Declaration of Independence. And what they will tell you is that Thomas Paine was the first real call, in fact, it may have been the very first public call for independence. But actually, it's far more significant than that, because when Thomas Paine writes Common Sense, and it's published as basically not even more than 50-page pamphlet, when he writes it, he doesn't even mention the question of independence or separating from Britain until quite a ways into the pamphlet. He opens up with a sort of a sense of Americans' democracy, of the fact that if you start out as an isolated group of people, removed from what he calls civilization, then he says certain kinds of, I'm paraphrasing, human instincts emerge. So he lays out a little tale of people who naturally, by way of their own sociability, reach out to each other in order to create a community. But even more significant than that idea of sociability, which is fundamental, is also the fact that he lays out a kind of tale of how they organize themselves as their numbers grow. And what he says is that they meet, the community meets under the limbs and the branches and the leaves of a vast oak tree. And the image he gives is that of a community which is fundamentally democratic. That is, that people associate with each other and deliberate together to work out the rules and regulations that will govern them. Now, it's interesting because, first of all, it's different, say, than the classical version of these sort of isolated communities that end up choosing a leader and eventually a king. This is the idea that fundamentally people are capable from the beginning of organizing themselves in a democratic fashion. The other thing is that it appeals to Americans because it provides them with a sort of, almost mythical image of themselves of having come to North America and having separated themselves in many ways from civilization. But here's the other thing. When Paine arrived in America at the end of 1774, as he came to know America in early 1775, he was astounded to find that Americans had basically thrown out British authority and had organized committees in towns and cities to govern themselves. So in a way, this story he tells at the beginning of Common Sense, this democratic, small d democratic story, is meant to be not only a reflection of a kind of mythical past, but it's also meant to be a reflection of what Americans themselves at that time on a grander scale are doing, okay? So he opens up Common Sense with an argument for democracy and the possibility of recovering democracy, because as he sees it and as he explains, the British government with its monarchy and its aristocracy and its commons, in the Parliament, the House of Lords and the House of Commons, and the King who has a sort of ultimate authority. This, he says, is an imposition on humanity. It's an imposition on the British people. So before he ever goes anywhere near the question of democracy, Paine is arguing for democracy as a fundamentally more humane and more progressive form of political organization than any of the kingdoms and ruling class arrangements that Europe or the rest of the world have. So democracy first, and then he goes on to talk about how kings bring war, how empires bring war, and that if Americans think about it, they don't need the kings and they don't need the empire. And in fact, they're not even British as they've been imagining themselves. They are fundamentally American. And that is
well, wait a second. What separated them from, let's say, those in India that lived in India under British rule?
Well,
the differences in rights and privileges?
As Britain would come to rule India, as it would rule any of the parts of the world that were people of color, we might say, they operated as an empire, a colonial empire, okay, with military occupation, or they created a military wherever they were. In America, they had already afforded Americans, by way of Americans' own initiatives, but also perhaps because they viewed these colonists as British at the outset, which they were, or diversely European. And the Americans themselves, however much they were diverse and however much, they came from various places in the world, they thought of themselves as British. But now Paine is showing them they don't need a king, they don't need an empire. And in fact, the English Constitution and the British government are corrupt and a threat to their very liberties. Whereas Americans wanted the rights of British, because they thought of themselves as British, they had come from the old world. Paine was saying, forget it. You have an opportunity to basically to start the world over again. You have the opportunity of creating a democratic republic. And he actually lays out a charter. He calls it a charter, but it's really a constitution, a highly democratic constitution, not one that's given by the king or parliament, but rather one that will emanate from the people. And he also builds into his idea of a constitution, this is really important, the idea of rights. So what we would later call a Bill of Rights, or they would later call a Bill of Rights, he says this must be built right into the Constitution. And the one he really does emphasize, well, there are two, one, security of one's home and property, but the other one, which is a really revolutionary argument for the late 18th century, is he talks about freedom of conscience or freedom of worship, freedom of religion. And I think it's about 3 to 5 times in the course of the pamphlet, he emphasizes the imperative that in the new nation that will be the United States, he doesn't use the term United States just yet, that separation of church and state are the best guarantee of freedom of conscience and freedom of religion. And he actually has a great line in Common Sense where he says, the only role for government in religion is to make sure everyone gets to practice it as they please. Really revolutionary statement, by the way. And that's one of the things that if Thomas Paine had really written the Declaration, I think I said this in the other episode we did, is that if he had written the Declaration of Independence, I am sure he would have built in an argument for separation of church and state, which he does in Common Sense.
He also explores that much later on in 1793-94 in the second half of Rights of Man about the separation of church and state, I believe.
That's in another pamphlet where it's called it's a 2-part pamphlet.
Age of Reason. I meant the Age of Reason. Excuse me. I meant the Age of Reason. There. All right. Rights of Man. He talks more about expounds on rights of individuals to have guaranteed income, Social Security.
That's Rights of Man.
Well, we'll get to that later on, maybe not on this program. I want to go back to, in Common Sense, it's a screed also, and he had firsthand experience on a grassroots level of the kind of system that was operating in England at that, or in the UK, I suppose, at that time.
Well, he came over and he was already almost middle age, as we would say, middle age.
Right. So, but he had seen it. He grew up. He really had a disdain for the capricious form of capital punishment. Can you go into how that system worked in England?
Yeah. Well, this goes in the 18th century. There had been a whole series of laws that were enacted that were directed as much against crimes of property as anything else. so that if you were, they were called the Black Acts in the 18th century, and it had to do with the idea of protecting the king, the royal property, protecting the royal, herds of deer. If you were to steal somebody's property, I mean, it was really directed at crimes of property. So in addition to the question of murder, okay, killing someone else, you might end up forfeiting your own life. It was also the idea that if you committed certain kinds of acts against royal property, or for that matter, property generally, you could be tried and subject possibly to capital punishment. They might think they were being kind to you if they put you on a ship and sent you off to Australia, okay, which was a prison colony.
But it didn't matter the age, though. It didn't matter the age. I mean, I read in there, in fact, you write about it, the age of an individual, if they were caught, stealing property, they could be 10 years old, 12 years old, could be a woman, that were subjected to potentially capital punishment.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about ultimately the judge's decision. But here's the thing: Paine, where he grew up, Thetford, England, which is in Norfolk, over in England. The town itself was the site of an annual set of trials, and at these trials, these were often capital trials, so that in fact there was a gallows hill in Thetford, where, and it said that from Paine's front step, from his parents' front yard, or front, they didn't have a yard, or front steps, you could actually see Gallows Hill. So from his earliest years as a child, Paine had this grisly image, you might say, of gallows and hangings. And by the way, talking about grisly, I mean, it was the kind of thing where when this court arrived in the town and pursued its deliberations, this was like a festival time. People just turned out. But for Paine, this was just a terrible, terrible kind of thing to witness as a child. And he always actually did oppose capital punishment.
Even for King Louis XVI.
Yeah, right. Later in the 1790s, when he's in France, and he's a prominent figure, a member of the National Assembly and the constituents, anyhow, the new National Parliament of France, when they decide that the king has committed treason, he is determined to vote, and he does vote no on the capital punishment question, on the execution of the king and his family. I mean,
he votes guilty, though.
We're jumping ahead, but it's worth noting. This is important because Paine did not oppose violence for the sake of liberty. What he did oppose was capital punishment.
Right.
And when he opposed the hanging, the guillotine, of the king and his family, this made him terrible enemies within the revolutionary elite.
Right.
Very
Robespierre. Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, we are jumping ahead. But so going back to common sense, he also lays out his disdain for just the hereditary rights of the monarchy, going all the way back.
Kings are bad enough. Kings are bad enough. And then we compounded, he says, with hereditary succession. I mean, in other words, the kings, their sons and their grandsons, it's a lineage. And he says, look, what do these kings bring? They bring war. They bring war with other kingdoms, and they bring war within Britain, within England itself, as the various dynastic families go to war with each other for who should serve, who would gain access to the kingdom, who would become the next royal figure, who would wear the crown. I mean, he just despises the idea of kings. He uses a whole variety of means to belittle them. He refers to the Bible, that the Jews had no king, and when they demanded one, that in fact the prophet said, what are you kidding? You don't want a king. God doesn't want you to have a king. He uses history, laying out the story of English kings and how bloody it was. And when not bloody, it was utterly ridiculous, he says. Not to mention the current kings in England were all rooted in the Norman conquest, you might say. And the Norman conquest, he actually says this royal bastard and his bandits come over from Normandy to conquer England, Alfred and all of that. So over and over again, he uses history, he uses reason, he uses humor, he uses the Bible to challenge the if you like, the the imperative of a royal. He challenges the very idea of a royal. He belittles the idea of kings.
Well, let me ask you this. So he has his firsthand knowledge. He'd been there for a long period of time. How many?
He got fired by the crown for having helped organize and represent the excise officers in their petition.
But all of the other founding fathers at that period of time, they had already been here for at least one generation. They really did. They knew about taxation. They knew about taxes here. They knew about
those. We're talking now, of course, the Declaration generation, not
that one. Yes,
right.
Yes.
Declaration.
Those people did not have the vision or the knowledge that Paine had.
And actually, they didn't have the direct the direct experience, but they too had serious questions about the idea of kings. But they weren't going to talk. Remember, if you belittled the king, you were basically a traitor. Paine was really going out on, what do they say, going out on a limb when he did this. And we already told the story of Benjamin Rush, who said to Paine, "You should write this pamphlet." And Paine said, "Well, why don't you do it?" He goes, "Well, I have too much to lose."
Right.
Okay.
So he was the Cyrano.
By the way, somebody else who really did resent Britain, but was by no means prepared to declare independence, was George Washington. He had been insulted many times by the British Army, the King's Army, because they failed to give him a commission in the King's Army. He had only ever been a colonial army officer, a Virginia officer.
Right.
So what's interesting is Washington is already in the field with an army when Paine is writing this. And I think you mentioned this last time, even though his army is in the field, even though Washington is leading an army up in New England against the King's Army, whenever he and his officers meet for dinner, the first thing they did was they toasted the king.
Right.
As a sign of their loyalty. They were loyal to the monarch and to the idea of the British Empire. What they were opposed to was Parliament's efforts to subject them to the rules and regulations that they had no share in deliberating and deciding upon.
What kind of influence did common sense have on the military, on the Continental Army at that period of time? It's
a great question, and here's why. Since the likes of Washington never spoke out, even though they were rebels, they had never spoken of what the rebellion was about, possibly. They never argued for, called for independence, for separation. And Washington himself never moves, never says anything of that sort until his own men have read common sense. And he actually says in a letter, again, this is to, I think, one of his aides, he says, "Common sense is working a wondrous change in the minds of the men." In other words, this is the moment where Washington, propelled by his own soldiers, has come out in favor of the cause of independence.
And at that time, I don't know when exactly Paine actually becomes an adjutant later on in 1776.
I can tell you that, right. So here's what happens. Common sense truly changes the entire rhetoric of the rebellion. Communities from New England to the South start sending letters and petitions to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, calling for independence. In other words, it's a popular demand. And in Congress, those folks would never have acted, had it not been for the popular clamor. And they then decide to start moving in favor of independence. So over the course of weeks, they ask the colonial governments to organize their governments anew. And then by July 2nd, they are prepared to start signing a Declaration of Independence. The official date becomes, of course, July 4th. When that independence is declared, Paine joins a Philadelphia militia. It's called the Flying Squadron. They couldn't fly, obviously, but they would move swiftly towards New York, and they would take up camp as part of the American forces around New York City, awaiting the arrival of what would be a new British army on a vast British fleet. What happens is they wait and wait and wait, and when the British fleet arrives, I mean, it's got 32,000 British soldiers on board these ships who are going to disembark in New York Harbor. This Philadelphia flying squadron, they decide this is hopeless. They up and head back to Philadelphia, but not Paine. He goes from an area sort of Bayonne, New Jersey, you know, just across from Staten Island, and he heads up to Fort Lee, where Nathaniel Greene, one of Washington's best generals, is located. And by this time, when he introduces himself as Thomas Paine, Greene, of course, welcomes him and makes him his aide, his adjutant. Why? Well, not only because Paine has got this great pen. I mean, he's got this is the pen that created or turned the rebellion into a revolution, but for another reason. Like Paine, Nathaniel Greene was raised by a Quaker parent, Well, Paine's father was a Quaker, Greene's parents were Quaker. And here was Nathaniel Greene deciding that the revolution was worth fighting, even though he was a Quaker, who were indeed pacifists. And he and Paine become very close. And there in Fort Lee, I don't know if most people who hear this may not know Fort Lee, New Jersey, but it's it's the Jersey side of the George Washington Bridge.
Right, I know it very well.
It's up on the Palisades, as you know.
Right. I drive by it every time I go up north, right up the Palisades.
So from there, Paine can look out across the river and see the battles underway in Manhattan. And by this time, Washington is really taking a beating. And it's clear that Washington is likely going to retreat and come across the river and come up at Gloucester Dock, which is north of Fort Lee. And indeed, they come down, Washington's army does just that. And Nathaniel Greene and Washington combine their forces in Fort Lee. And this is where Washington and Paine first meet. And then there's a famous retreat from Fort Lee across what we think of today as, say, Bergen County. And then they head south. They cross the Hackensack River and they head south towards what would be Newark and Elizabeth. Along the way, and keep in mind that Paine is in the headquarters that Washington and Greene have established. Paine is in conversation with Washington and Greene, and Washington just adores Paine because he was the man who put his pen to work in calling for a revolution. He knows common sense. And basically, it's either Greene or Washington who says to Paine, it's time to take up your pen again. We need your words again. Before this, Paine was still writing, but he was basically writing sort of journalism that he was sending back to Philadelphia, reporting on the war. Now Paine, goes out into the camp, and it's said on the head of a drum by a campfire, he begins to write. And the opening words of the first crisis paper are some of the most famous words in all of American history. These are the times that try men's souls. Okay, right. And by the way, if you Google those words, these are the times that try men's souls, you'll not only get the historical reference to them, you will also discover how many folks since then have been citing it and quoting it, including the losing team's coaches at halftime in just about every sport.
And that's also where Winter Soldier versus Summer Soldier comes in.
That's right, which of course will come up much later, once again in American history, during the later years of the Vietnam War, the Winter Soldiers movement, which was a veterans movement against the war in Vietnam, that in fact John Kerry became the spokesperson for.
I see. So now we're going towards the end of 1776. Washington,
they've retreated
in a lot of
across
trouble.
New Jersey.
Right? Washington's in a lot of trouble. And
the retreat is awful.
Now, where does Paine finish American Crisis #1? Does he finish?
Well, we don't know where. It's possible that what he's done is he's drafting it along the way. He requests permission from either Washington or Greene to leave the army and go to Philadelphia ahead of them by horse. Now, I'll just point out that Washington around this time had written to a cousin, I believe it was a cousin, and says to him, if we get hit one more time by the British Army, it's all over. The revolution is over if that happens. And fortunately, Howe was moving too slowly. He didn't strike Washington's army again, or it would have been all over. Because along the way in the retreat across New Jersey, The first thing to know is that the militiamen, as opposed to the regular American army, the militiamen were basically, they were leaving. They figured their enlistment was over. They're going home to their families and their farms. So by the time they reach the Delaware River and cross over to Pennsylvania, there's not a hell of a lot left of the army, okay? Now, Paine, meanwhile, has headed to Philadelphia to finish the pamphlet and get it published, printed, let's put it that way. It gets printed within days of Christmas and immediately placed vast, I don't know the number of copies. It's sent up to Washington and his army on along the Delaware River. It's not that far north of Philadelphia, but that would be not far north in a car. By wagon, it's a bit of a trip. When Washington reads this, he is so thrilled by the words, he distributes it to his officers and says to his officers, before we embark to cross the Delaware to attack the Hessians, these German mercenary troops over in New Jersey and Trenton, read these words to your men before they get in the boats. So
that's not an apocryphal story. I mean,
no, it absolutely, definitely happened.
Yeah.
In fact, I'll go a step further. Another historian, it wasn't my work that did this, another historian, well-known historian of the American Revolution, I think it was David Hackett Fisher, he is convinced that the only way that Washington even got the boats to the Delaware side of the river to cross back over to New Jersey is because the boatmen read common sense and realized they had to act as well. So they do arrive with the boats load, they go to Trenton and they win this pivotal battle, okay? They catch the Hessians by surprise, they're sleeping off a drunk from Christmas, and they win the Battle of Trenton, and then they go on to win the Battle of Princeton, which is to say to Americans, the revolution ain't over yet, okay? We will continue the fight.
It ain't over till it's over, as Mr. What was the name of the baseball player? Yogi Berra would say.
Yeah.
So this goes into after Christmas, and now 1777.
Right.
Comes and in the early months, he continues writing these crisis papers.
Yeah, he will write.
How many? 13 or 16?
Here's interesting. You're right. He writes 13 official crisis papers, ones that bear numbers, because he wants one for each colony turned state, and one for each of the new states. He writes, I think, 2 or 3. He writes 3 others that he calls supplemental, because he doesn't want to run out of the numbers yet. So he does write a total of 16, but 13 bear numbers, 1, 2 through 13. And this will be all through the course of the war. Whenever the war looked like whenever it looked like the Americans might lose, or for example, when the Congress began to talk about removing Washington from command because he wasn't winning battles, Paine would write a pamphlet. In fact, one of the early pamphlets is great. He actually writes it to, I think, to a British, like the head of the British Army, or, he writes it in a way that says, you guys should give up now. And if you don't, I may actually write it. I may go back to England and write a pamphlet to rouse the British in a revolution. It's a very interesting kind of thing he does. I mean, it's audacious, but it's his way of trying to instill in Americans, and especially Washington's troops, the sense of possibility, that this is not going to be a quick war. We're going to have to fight this out. Last week, I believe you quoted the line of Barlow, okay, who you first said Adams, but it was actually Barlow who said, without the sword of Paine, without the pen of Paine, Washington's sword would have been wielded in vain. And Washington knew it. He knew that the entire war depended not only on his command of the army, but equally on Thomas Paine's pen.
For the enthusiasm. Did he acknowledge that personally?
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, they were close. And even during and after the war, they would meet. Even during and after the war, they would meet. There was no question. Later, just for the reference, in the 1790s, which we'll tell a story maybe in a third episode of why Washington and Paine fall out. But I don't want to tell it now.
Right. I'm not at that point in the book. I'm almost there. But going back to going back to the 1777, Washington, his chief of staff is Hamilton. How did he and Paine get along?
I have no idea.
Nobody knows.
I don't know.
I've looked all over. I've never been able.
I'm just not aware. Hamilton and Paine were not likely friends.
Right.
Okay. Not
So,
likely. So they had one thing in common. They were both immigrants.
right, and they both came from poor stock, but
Yeah.
one felt more comfortable with the gentry, and the other one with the common.
Well, of course, Hamilton had gone to law school.
That's right.
Yeah.
So now we go into the middle of 1777. How does it unfold there? And what is
Paine becomes? It's interesting. John Adams, as much as he didn't care for Paine's revolutionary spirit, Adams was a smart guy, and Adams figured Paine's pen would do us well if we could bring him into our new government, the government that had, the Continental Congress was now the American Congress, and so Adams and others arranged for Paine to become the secretary of the Committee on Foreign Affairs.
Yes.
So that all the correspondence and whatever that had to do with trying to raise money from France or possibly negotiate with other countries to recognize them, that was all funneled through Paine's office. And Paine was very good at it. However, something came up in the course of his time as the secretary to the committee that turned out to be a major, major embarrassment for the American government, because Paine became a whistleblower. There were American representatives in Europe trying to raise funds to underwrite the war. And there was a man, very greedy guy named Silas Deane. Deane was basically, when monies would be handed over or supplies were going to be delivered, the French at the outset for quite some time did it without making it public, you might say. I mean, the British suspected it, but there was no formal announcement by the French that they were going to support the Americans. But what Deane was doing is that he was literally trying to make a profit on securing the aid. So in other words, his own salary he thought was insufficient because he thought of himself as needing more. And he would literally, sort of, what's that called? Embezzlement? I forget the term right now.
Right. Yes.
He was pulling money out of the monies dedicated to right. So here's what happens. Paine becomes aware of this because of the correspondence that he's responsible for, and he lets it be known that Deane is cheating the American government. Now, here's the thing. Deane was good friends with a lot of the more conservative elite members of the Congress, like a man named Gouverneur Morris, who we mentioned, I think, who was a merchant and a lawyer who traveled back and forth between New York and Philadelphia. Okay, people like that who already didn't care for Paine because he was a rather common person, but with a brilliant pen, who was calling for democracy, and that's the last thing these people wanted. I mean, in my book, I lay out the kinds of words folks like Gouverneur Morris had for the ordinary farmer and artisan. So anyhow, they literally chastise Paine, and he gets sacked. Okay, he's gone. So he then has to, once again, he's back. He has to fall back on his own resources, you might say.
So now he's got that position. Did he go to France at that point in time?
That's very late in the war. Very late in the war.
Right.
What he does is that he becomes more directly involved in the Pennsylvania state government, and is also active in helping organize and rallying the radicals and progressives in Pennsylvania in favor of writing a very, very democratic constitution for the new state of Pennsylvania.
It was unlike any other.
It was basically unlike any other, right, essentially unlike any other. I mean, it really was a far more progressive document. And he really wanted to ensure the fact that it wouldn't only be property holders who could vote. He wanted to make sure that ordinary farmers and ordinary working people could have a voice in government. So these are the kind of things he did in the course of the war, but he always was committed to the American Revolution as a whole. And among the people that he befriended, and he was still friendly with the likes of Franklin, and he became friends with Jefferson and others, what happens is that there was one young man who was commissioned to go to France to raise more monies. Okay, I believe Franklin is already back over there. And Paine accompanies him on this mission. Strangely enough, by the time they accomplish their mission, the war ends. But in the voyage from Philadelphia to Europe, they get attacked, and Paine reportedly serves as a real swordsman in fighting the enemies, the enemy sailors. So he was always dedicated.
In your book that he actually got into a sword fight.
Right, that's right.
Route. So,
yeah.
But this is after 1781. After
right. This is around 1781, 17, right in there.
So he goes before the April 21st signing of the Treaty of Paris.
I don't remember if he's specifically there. He's already on his way back here. Because remember, that's 1783. He's back by then.
He's already back.
The war ends in 1781. The treaty is until 1783.
I see. So he's back.
But at the end of the revolution, Paine has to figure out how he's going to make a living.
Right. Well, what did he do? I mean, by the way, he did give $500 of his own money for the Continental Army, I believe.
Oh, he never even took royalties from anything he wrote.
Not even Rights of Man or.
Well, wait, that's later. That's
right.
later.
But
we're talking American Revolution. He took no royalties. Common sense. He could have made a hell of a lot of money, I would expect. Well, in those days, but indeed, he said all of the royalties from Common Sense, if you can collect them, should be used to buy mittens for Washington's troops.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So, but he wasn't a man of great means. But in your book here, which we're going to hold up right here, is there's a story in there about how he tried to get others to finance, others to put money into it, landowners.
He also wrote a pamphlet calling on, like, Rhode Island was hesitant about giving money. A lot of this, remember, they didn't have to give money, the states. This was something that they were told they should do, but they could resist the idea of paying their fair taxes to the American government. And Paine would write pamphlets chastising people for those states that had failed to pay their monies. Remember, they're operating under something called the Articles of Confederation. I'll give you another example of his commitment. So the Articles of Confederation really took years to formally accept. And so they're operating it with a kind of gentleman's agreement that they're in effect. One of the questions that came up in creating the unified government was, there are the big states and there are the landlocked states. So you've got Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, New York. They could look west, keeping in mind what I've said before on the other occasion. They could look west and see unbounded opportunities.
Yes.
But if you're Rhode Island or Connecticut or New Jersey or Delaware, you're landlocked basically to the west. You've got the ocean, but you're limited. You cannot grow geographically.
Virginia had that in mind.
Yes, they all did. North Carolina, Virginia, New York. But here's the thing. The question was, what happens to the Western lands? Paine wrote a pamphlet called The Public Good, or Public Good. And Paine said that they should create a territory, the Northwest Territories. And if any of those territories if any part of them should wish to organize as a state and seek admission to the Union, they would come in as a new state. That the boundaries of the West, on the west of these colonies, now states, should be the boundaries of those states. They could not go west. So this would allow for new states to enter the Union, like Kentucky eventually, and Ohio, and so on.
How was that received by Jefferson and the Randolph?
Well, I mean, it may well have been resented by any number of Virginians, but I think that they understood that this was a way, by the way, of securing the Confederation. It was a way of securing it. And they already had far more land than the likes of New Jersey or Connecticut, Rhode Island, or even Massachusetts for that matter.
All right, listen, we're going to take a quick break here and get to the post-war years up into Paris and England after the war, and what he did to try to scratch out a living right after the war was over. So we're going to take a break right here, Professor, and we're going to play what we did the other day, because I like it so much, Barbra Streisand from Pins and Needles.
Yeah, I love that song.
Status Quo. We'll be right back in just 1 minute.
In 1776, Tom Paine was writing books with might and main. The Tories said, now man alive, stop giving out with this here liberty jive.
Stop giving out with this here liberty jive.
Don't sing out people's rights that way. They might believe in what you say. So stop your song, it's not polite. Pipe down before you start a fight.
You don't say, teacher, is that right?
But Tom Paine looked ahead, and to those Tories Thomas said, no, 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 no. When you got to go, you got to go. You can't stand still on freedom's track. If you don't go forward, you go back. You can't giddy up by saying whoa and sitting on your status quo.
Okay, you told us a story. That's from a play called, a Broadway play called Pins and Needles. Barbra Streisand. Now, I want to move to the other side of 1783 and Paine trying to make a living, and he begins by trying to secure some kind of pension. So can you walk us through that?
Washington tried to secure him a pension from Virginia, I believe, and some others too, but there was still an animosity towards Paine for having called for an end of slavery. So there were those in the Virginia, what they call it, the House of Burgesses, whatever they called it, that they were not going to do that. New York State does give him a cottage and lands that had been taken from a Tory family, a loyalist family, and some monies do come his way. The Congress offered him an opportunity to become the historian of the Revolution and of the United States. He turned it down. He actually wrote a little essay on how American history should be written, which I don't want to get into right here, but he turned it down, partly because the salary was so low, he could never have managed on it, and also because he had other things that were occupying his mind. And most importantly, and this is something I really want to mention, Thomas Paine, when he was a boy, was fascinated not only by poetry, Shakespeare and Milton. He was also fascinated by science and technology. And he had this idea that, in fact, during the war, he and Washington would try experiments together, sort of creating new kinds of weapons and things like that. After the war, Paine decided what he wanted to do was he wanted to create an iron bridge. Okay, this was there were no iron bridges in the United States. They just didn't exist at the time. The bridges that cross rivers like the Schuylkill and others. And keep in mind, if you look at an American map, it's all rivers that flowing out of the Adirondacks and elsewhere that flow into the Atlantic. And Paine thought if America needed to be united, if you were going to travel from Boston, say, to Charleston, you didn't go by land, you went by boat. But most people aren't going to get on a boat. How can we cross these rivers without getting on a boat or a ferry? And the bridges that existed were wooden. And in the wintertime, the ice would literally destroy the bridges. So Paine had the idea, he's going to not invent, but he's going to develop an iron bridge. And he really does create a very, very interesting plan. He impresses the foremost inventor of the day, Benjamin Franklin, his friend. And Franklin says, this is a project that you really must pursue. The problem was that there were no banks worth speaking of. There were sums of money, but no banks. So Paine there was one bank in Philadelphia, basically. Paine needed funds. So Franklin told him, look, maybe this is the opportunity or the time for you to go back to Europe, to London and Paris, and raise money for the Iron Bridge, okay? For Paine, this was really important because if you're going to have a united country, you have to have means of you have to be able to have people travel You have to have trade going north and south, and you couldn't depend just on the ocean, just on seas and boats. So he actually goes in 1787, he leaves from Philadelphia and he goes to Europe.
Well, wait.
Oh,
Can
sorry,
I want to going back to the bridge there. He did try to secure money from a bank, and he wasn't opposed to banks. A lot of the small farmers were, and he got some flack for that, but he had a good explanation.
Yeah, Paine was like a champion of what we'll call national development. But instead of like going overseas to create, to help other nations develop, because at this point, the only democracy in the making was the United States, Paine's idea was to create banks to fund things such as iron bridges, north and south. Now, farmers didn't like the idea because they saw banks as the kind of thing that would, literally rip them off. But the artisan community in places like Philadelphia and Boston and elsewhere, at least half the artisans thought it was a good idea because they had ambitions to turn their little enterprises perhaps into larger enterprises. And to do that, they might need capital. So, yeah, I mean, it was a big battle, a very big battle. Some people accused Paine of turning against the average man, but as far as he was concerned, this was a way of advancing the average man. He was not like Hamilton, who wanted to create a class of merchant capitalists. That's not what he wanted to do. He wanted to create a vast class of prospering American artisans and workers.
All right, so he doesn't get the funding here, and he sails off to Europe, or I don't know, did he go to London first, or did he go to Paris first?
He probably went to London first because he could speak English.
Right. So what takes place there when he gets to London?
Well, first thing to know is that over the next couple of years, he's going back and forth, London and Paris.
Well, Paine at that point was being vilified or being smeared.
No. You're jumping the gun. You're too eager to jump the gun.
Oh, okay. It wasn't then. Adams didn't call him an alcoholic. It was later on. All right, so
you're jumping the gun.
Here's
the point. He's in London. He's in Paris, going back and forth, and he actually built like a quarter-size model of what would be the bridge, and he actually opened it up as a tourist attraction. People would pay to come in and cross the bridge. It was on land or maybe a creek, who knows. But the point was that even during this time, there were these movements that were developing in England, inspired in part by the American Revolution and inspired by the fact that England is entering into its industrial revolution and artisans' livelihoods are threatened. I mean, there's real ferment in England. And Paine, let's keep in mind, Paine in 1789, the French Revolution erupts, and Paine is invited basically to come to France to witness what's happening. Okay?
Right.
The Bastille has been, has been torn down. Lafayette, who had been an American officer under Washington, who had come from France to fight with Washington, he actually gives Paine the key to the Bastille as a symbol of the end of the French, oppressive monarchy. They're going to now have a constitutional monarchy. And he tells Paine, this key is for you to take back to the United States and as a gift to Washington. Now, here's what happens. Edmund Burke, a major conservative figure in Parliament, writes a pamphlet attacking the French Revolution. Reflections on the Revolution in France. Now, Paine is outraged by that pamphlet. Outraged by it. Because,
by the way, wait a second. How influential was that book by Burke?
Well, it was very influential amongst the upper classes. Because keep in mind, if you're a British conservative, or even for that matter, a British liberal, and you see a revolution has erupted in France, okay? Remember, they don't behead the king at this point. The idea was to create a constitutional monarchy. But if you see a revolution commencing in France, okay, with violent it's going to be a violent upheaval as far as the British are concerned. This is a threat. The distance from England to France is pretty, for those of you who know anything about geography, you'll realize it's a very short distance. You get on a boat, you're over in, you just cross the English Channel in a matter of a certain number of hours. Okay. So the British aristocracy is, this is not a welcome development, and the crown, you can imagine, is outraged. And so Burke's pamphlet, Reflection on the Revolution in France, became a pretty successful pamphlet, but not with common people necessarily. Paine's not the only one who writes in response to Burke. Mary Wollstonecraft,
right,
sort of the mother of modern feminism, she writes in response to Burke, as do others. There is actually this sort of developing sort of movement that wants to see reform at the least in England. But then Paine enters the picture, and he writes the first of what will be 2 volumes or two hefty pamphlets. His piece is called Rights of Man. And he stands on the American Revolution and is basically saying, in America, we have carried out a revolution. We have brought an end to monarchy. We have created a democratic republic. These are the grounds upon which others can stand in favor of bringing an end to the scourge of monarchy. Rights of Man, okay? Yes. And this pamphlet explodes when it's published. And it becomes, it's translated throughout Europe, it becomes this major pamphlet that literally sets fire to the Atlantic world, you might say, as did Common Sense in America in its day. And it becomes almost like what later in working class history on the continent is the Communist Manifesto. This is the manifesto of modern revolution. And English working people embrace it. Middle class and working people embrace this. This becomes their manifesto.
This is the first part there, because it's written in 2 pieces.
First part,
right? Right.
Yes.
So this is in 1790, 91?
This is probably 1790, 91. The other one's going to come out in 1791 and becomes, 1792. It's that kind of separation between them. It's 2 different themes. The first one is definitely the sort of celebration of the possibilities of the French Revolution. He's comparing the French Revolution to the American Revolution. But the English embrace it, English working people embrace it as a pamphlet that speaks to them against the likes of Burke. Burke says, how dare these people try to overturn tradition and order and hierarchy? I mean, how dare they? Whereas Paine is saying, that's all bullshit, okay? I mean, the fact is that, people have suffered under under monarchy. They've suffered under the aristocracy, and they're trying to create a new world, not unlike the world Americans are trying to create across the Atlantic.
All right. Well, I think we're going to end it there with the first half of the Rights of Man, because I want to talk a lot about the French Revolution and stuff afterwards about Paine. But I want to end it there and continue this discussion in the next couple of days. We're at an hour here, and it went by so quickly. But is that a good place to?
Yes, it is, because when we return, so people know, we can talk about Paine's being back in England, the way in which the government is harassing him, the way in which the government really does fear the possibility of an English or British revolution, how Rights of Man literally sets fire not only in England to working class imaginations, but also in Ireland and in Scotland. So we've got a lot to talk about still.
Okay, well, that's it. We'll continue with Rights of Man the same way we continued with Common Sense at the top of this show. All right, Professor, I really appreciate your time. It's so interesting, engrossing for me. I feel like a student in your class. You must have like students that absolutely adore you because you have such a great manner of communicating.
That's nice of you to say. I'm sure there are those who despise me as well for the grades they get. Who knows?
It's probably relatives of Edmund Burke.
Probably. Right. Yeah, that's right.
Right. So we're gonna go out again with another version of Tom Paine's Bones.
Yes, and by the way, Randy, we'll explain to everyone why Tom Paine's Bones is such a thematic in this Tom Paine story, but we'll leave that to the end.
Okay, yes, we definitely will. So once again, thank you very much, Professor. We'll be right back with some closing remarks.
Out one evening by a river of discount town, tied Tom straight into old Tom Paine. As running down the road he went, he said, I can stop right now, child. King George is after me. He tied a rope around my throat and hang on the liberty tree. But I will dance to Tom Paine's bones, dance to Tom Paine's bones. I will dance on the oldest but I own to the rhythm of Tom Paine's bones. Dance to Tom Paine's bones, dance to Tom Paine's bones. I will dance on the oldest but I own to the rhythm of Tom Paine's bones.
I'm Randy Critical Live on the Fly. You know, this is on our website at Assange Countdown to Freedom. You can also get it at Live on the Fly YouTube channel and many other platforms, including iTunes and Podtails and many others. Now we're going to continue our programming. We're going to get back into strictly Assange material after this series is over with Mr. Kaye and Tom Paine. But we certainly could use your help. If you could give us a little support, you can go to AssangeCountdownToFreedom.com. We're just looking to pay the basic expenses here: website, engineer, little things like that, editing. So once again, I thank you for listening. We're going to go out, as we have for the last 5 or 6 shows, with Billie Holiday and our memorial to those who've been victimized by some very, very bad people in our police departments across the country. See you next time, very soon.
With what has happened. So the last 2 centuries, African Americans gunned down by law enforcement, enslaved, put to work, convict leasing, put in jail with the drug war. But in the last week, it's really heated up and it's got to stop.
Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolia, sweet and fresh. Then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain together for the wind to set, for the sun to rise, for the tree to drop. Here's a strange and bitter curse.